Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to dissect and analyze the epic, the amazing, the awe-inspiring, the powerful, the impactful power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin. So I just got on LinkedIn because I was trying to look up, how to introduce our guest for the episode. And then the first post that popped up on my feed is this small business owner who said they're making over $550K a year, and they've decided they're still not going to pay college tuition for their daughter.
I have so many issues with that too. One of the most frustrating things I see on the internet and on LinkedIn and things like that is people who project something that's true for them onto other people. And one of the things is, I see this a lot with college, where so many people are like, look at everything I accomplished and I didn't go to college. College would have been a waste of time. College is a waste of money. It's a waste. Drop out of college now. It's a story that's so fucking toxic because I went to college. It was amazing. It was super worth it for me. It changed my life. It was a great educational experience. But more than that, I grew up a lot. I made a lot of great friends. I learned how to navigate in the world as an adult without having having the risks of being an adult. And now that I look at the 4 years of college and the 4 years after the college, I think the 4 years after college were actually more impactful for me overall. But I think the only reason I was able to be successful and have those strong 4 years after college was because of those 4 years of college. So that is my experience. Now, I'm not saying college is for everyone. I also understand it's very privileged where we were able to go and we were able to go to a great school and we had a very privileged college experience.
I agree, and that's kind of why I'm a little tempted to read the full article just to understand their whole journey. But I think something huge about the college experience is not so much the education itself, but it creates this, let's say, bubble of privilege where it makes it very easy for you to socialize
and fuck up.
Yeah, to the point where now that I've graduated. I mean, we both graduated. I sometimes think about just how easy it was maybe to get socialized when you were a student. You're in that environment. You have a highly selective group of people where you have a recurrent environment where you meet them regularly and just communicate and get to know them. I think I was so fine-tuned to socializing within the school setting that now that I'm out of it, I'm having a hard time adjusting. How to socialize when you're not a student anymore, you're not in that environment.
It's an interesting point. But it's different. You're right. The socializing is different. And it's weird. Sometimes my therapist is like, well, if you want to meet people and I want to meet people and socialize more, it's always been a goal. She's like, well, you have to go out and actually do things,
Yeah. How do you do that?
Yeah, it's weird because after you graduate college, that's the first time where you have to make an intentional effort. A part of you is clinging on to your college relationships because those are your main social friendships. A part of you is trying to build work relationships, but work relationships are harder because you're all in different stages. You're all figuring out different things, and it's a weird thing.
Yeah.
And I also think something that's interesting is you have a very different experience where you've always been fully remote working.
You see people talk about, that first, second, and third place in your life that people have. The first place being your home, second place being your work, and third place is where you socialize. With a fully remote environment, you have that merge of first and second place, right? Where your home environment and work environment become the same. But my confusion is with how did that third place, that socializing space, used to be like for people?
It's a good question. It's something I talk to my therapist a lot. When you're out of college, you have to make conscious efforts to build social experiences. And it's kind of about living that portfolio life, living a balanced life. You have to make conscious efforts to cut into these experiences. And I also think we have to adapt the way we think about it. Like the free places thing, I don't think makes any sense anymore. We have to adapt. We have to change. This is our new reality, and we have to find ways that work for us and ways that work for society. But there's all these books coming out, like Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and he talks about the generation that grew up on the phones, right? And he talks about some of the anxieties and body image and like issues with social media. So this is the thing that we have to understand is that we have to adapt to our society now.
Yeah, and speaking of try and live in new experiences, this week we have Christina Wallace. She is what she calls a human Venn diagram. A little hard to just simply describe who Christina is. So let's give a short list of what she's done. Christina has been an entrepreneur. She right now teaches entrepreneurial management at Harvard Business School. She has spent a lot of her career at the intersection of business, technology, and all kinds of arts. And she also happens to be a co-producer of quite a few Tony Award nominated musicals. We're going to talk to Christina about her career and life journey, how she explores, embraces her interdisciplinary experience and career, and what that might mean for the rest of us to understand, how to kind of discover identity, explore a relationship between work and life. So let's get started.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. Cause life can be dry, better dressed for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gaurav and Kevin.
And Christina, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
I introduce myself as a human Venn diagram. It is a phrase I landed on probably more than a decade ago as a way to make sense of my story at first glance. I've been interdisciplinary since childhood. I started out, I say I was fluent in math, music, and English. I don't really remember a part of my life without all three of those pieces. And it's not just the specific worlds themselves, it's the intersection of those worlds that I've really made my mark as a professional. So I've had the opportunity to study quite deeply mathematics, theater, music, physics, computer science, business, and have crafted this zigzag career arc that on the surface is always like, what is she doing next? But is always tied back to this intersection of business, technology, and the arts. So I started my career as a theater director, worked on the arts management side at the Metropolitan Opera, went off to business school to learn a little bit more about how organizations are run. In the middle of, not even the middle, the very beginning of business school, the financial crisis hits. Suddenly the job market is terrible, and the school starts to put an emphasis on entrepreneurship. If you can't get a job, you can make your own job. And I discover startups, which had never been part of my family, my home life growing up, but realized that a lot of what I loved about making art and theater and music was similar in making early stage startups, sort of finding the idea, recruiting a team, and like figuring it out before the curtain goes up and then being very iterative as you learn more from your audience, quite literally an audience in theater, but user base in the startup world. And so I did that for a decade professionally in the world of tech entrepreneurship while continuing to pursue the arts on the side. I sang in an all-tech a cappella group for a while, sang in other choirs, found ways to kind of keep this other world. And then had the opportunity 4 years ago to come back to Harvard Business School, this time as a professor, and join the faculty to teach entrepreneurship while I'm in a chapter of my life that it's just early stage startups aren't a good fit. And so I've made like a full circle back and found again ways to kind of bring in the business of the arts and other things in through producing on Broadway, through angel investing, and really still very much sitting at that intersection of business, technology, and the arts.
That's amazing. We always start the episodes with what's your story, and by nature of the show we produce, we have very unique people, right? And every time they start off with some version of, well, my story is not linear. My story is a little bit different. My story is like they're justifying their curves, right?
Yeah.
And it's always some version of that because they're kind of like, listen, I know my story is not the LinkedIn story. This is different. This is weird. And it's such a interesting pattern because it's everyone, right? Everyone's
Yes.
like, well, my story is not linear. So I love that kind of owner of it and being like, not ashamed of the curves, but honestly, like, hey, this is how I got here.
Yeah. Well, and you hit exactly on this, that I think so many folks think that they are the anomaly with this like nonlinear path, when in fact, I can't name someone my age or younger who's had a linear path. Like that's the world we're in, that is both changing pretty significantly from an external perspective, and due to a number of factors, it has become more acceptable socially for us to also change, to have your priorities shift, to have your interests morph over time, and to be able to pursue those interests. My grandfather built cars for General Motors for 4 decades. He had the same job at the same assembly line for literally his entire career. Now, he changed as a man significantly over that period, but his work was not an expression of who he was. It was just what he did. And I think had he been given the opportunity to think through, like, how do I want to reinvent myself a decade or two into this, I think he would have been excited about that idea. But that wasn't the relationship that we had with work when he was growing up or sort of coming through the workforce. The more that we've tied work to self-expression, the more it's become imperative that we accept these zigzags. Because you are not the same person at 60 that you were at 20. And you don't need the same things. You probably don't want the same things. And so being open to that nonlinear path and saying, actually, that's the default. And your job is to just help make sense of it when you're explaining that path to other people. It doesn't have to be linear, but you can't talk for an hour. So how do you kind of find the arc, the through line to that story when you're talking about who you are, rather than just repeating the chronology of your experience?
It's a really interesting point. And I've noticed this a lot in parts of your book and also like in different interviews. In this idea, you talk a lot about identity and a lot about this issue that we have as society, but tying your career into your identity.
Yeah.
Kevin and I are quite early in our careers. Like we graduated in the pandemic in 2020. We started our careers pretty immediately, but already it happened. It happened immediately where we both kind of really tied our identities. At least I won't speak for Kevin, but I did in a huge amount of way. It has a lot to do with a number of things. One, Kevin and I are both immigrants. We're both on visas, right? And graduating in that environment, you have to get a job or you have to leave, right?
Yeah.
So getting a job was not just like something to do. It was an imperative. And then I graduated without a job in 2020 with like a ticking clock. And so then I started my first job. And then Kevin and I both, since then, got laid off and both got new jobs. And that was such a mindset shift for me when I got the dream job. I spent 4 years working for it. My visa worked out. Everything worked out. It was connected. And then while I was on vacation in Europe with my family, I got laid off, right?
Yeah.
And that is such a mindset shift.
Yes.
Because now we're finding a new job. Now we're figuring out other things. But it's like when you get laid off from your first job, you're like, well, who am I?
Who am I? That's such a key question. And you see this in layoffs very clearly, because you're kind of like, am I bad at my job or was I just unlucky? And it's not only like, I don't know the story to tell in my interviews. I don't know the story to tell to myself. Am I supposed to take something from this and change and learn and grow? Or was this just the luck of the draw and I got to get back out there, right? It's so ambiguous. But you see the same reaction to, interestingly enough, not just entrepreneurs in a moment of failure, which I experienced very viscerally. You also see this in moments where entrepreneurs have an exit, where they sell their company and they walk away. And now they're like, well, who am I? Like this has been who I am. Who am I? They experience psychologically the same loss that someone whose startup failed experiences, which I find fascinating because it really does come back to this close tie that we have to our work. And I see this also in a very similar way to people who have romantic relationships and they find their identity, or they connect their identity so clearly to that couple, right? That the fact that they are coupled up. And that can contribute to this huge destabilization. You see this often in women who marry young and become stay-at-home moms, right? That is their identity. And when they lose it, it's hugely destabilizing. And so part of this work, particularly in this era where, I mean, you literally graduated in the middle of a disruption, the pandemic, and then you got laid off due to headwinds of economic disruption that you have no control over. This isn't going away. This state of disruption, this constant shift, whether it's geological or geopolitical or biological or technological, these extreme forces are not going away. So it is imperative that we build a self expression and an identity, an understanding of who we are that is independent of these other pieces. It expresses itself through your work, through your relationship, through your hobbies. But you are a person, you have value, you have a unique way of seeing the world that still exists when you are single and unemployed and like can't get out of bed, like that's it's not something that we're ever taught to focus on or develop all the way through school. And you don't really notice that you don't have it until the moment you need it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think for me, I think it's supercharged because of the immigrant experience. But I feel like there's similar patterns with everyone in this where it's the first thing you say at a networking, not even, forget networking event, that's very businessy, but it's the first thing you say often on like just meeting people in general. It's something that I selfishly, because I've worked at big name companies and I've worked very hard to get where I am and they're very competitive roles, but I take a lot of pride in it.
Yes.
I find a lot of safety in being able to say, I do this. Right? And it's scary.
Those are two different things, though.
Okay.
It is like to take pride in what you've accomplished, absolutely understandable. And introducing yourself through your work, it's a natural shorthand, especially here in the US. It's a natural way to say, there are lots of dimensions of me, but this is going to give you a lot of information all at once. So I'm going to start that introduction that way. But the safety, I think, is misplaced, as you both have experienced.
Yeah.
The safety is a relic of our parents' generation or our grandparents' generation, when labor and management had a different contract. My grandfather worked for his entire life for General Motors, and they kept him employed. They gave him a pension. It's the reason he was able to retire with dignity. That expectation of lifelong employment, God, that's completely gone. But even the expectation of employment, as long as you are meeting expectations, also gone. We saw this during some of the big labor shifts post the Great Resignation, and that like this whole like boomerang almost of labor, where in the tech world particularly, we were seeing people who had been at these big companies, Google and Meta and Apple and elsewhere, who'd been there 15 years, who had always been top performers, getting laid off. Because you know what? They're some of the more expensive people there. So there's no loyalty, which means there's no safety. And it could be, you could say that's a very cynical way of seeing the world, but I just think it's safer to acknowledge that because then you have the right set of information to be making your calculations with.
For me, when I got laid off, I was supposed to be I was told I was getting promoted that month, right? So I personally,
Sorry, that's just so very American.
I personally think it was an overcorrection. That's
Yeah.
my opinion. But
Sure.
no, but it's a weird thing when you get laid off, and it's a weird. But even forgetting about that, which is a traumatic experience that a lot of people have been going through.
Yeah.
It's just in careers, changing careers, changing connections, when it's so much of your time. Whether it's you're doing your own startup or whether it's you've invested all this time and all these sunk costs. And I'm sure, and I promised Kevin this whole thing wasn't going to be me asking HBS questions. I was like, yeah, I'm going to ask a couple Harvard Business School questions, and I promise it's not going to be the whole thing. We had a whole conversation. But with HBS, I'm sure you're teaching a lot of students who are very driven, right? Who have very
by definition.
By definition, you are self-selecting for this type of audience where it's well, we've had a focus. This is what we set our lives around. This is how we got here. How big of a mindset shift does this put for your life for them, or kind of teaching them balance at all?
Yeah, it's I'll give you a perfect story to illustrate this. When the book first came out, I gave the talk to all of the graduating HBS students. This was the week before graduation, when they're in that mindset of okay, I got to go back in the world. Who do I want to be? What is my future? And I gave them the talk and explained the portfolio life model. And then I asked if they had any questions. And the very first question, this young woman raised her hand and she said, just so I can be clear, what is the index that I should be comparing my portfolio's performance to know whether or not I'm generating alpha?
Yes.
And I was like, I think you have missed the entire point of this metaphor. Her immediate reaction was not, I want to be happy. It's, I want to do better than everyone else. And so I was like, okay, it feels like you just need to sit with this. And when you come back for your 10-year reunion, we'll talk again. But so some of them have that perspective for sure. And as you can tell, a pretty big mindset shift is required. But many of them come to business school because they want to make a pivot in their career. They want to make this shift. And business school is one of the kind of the only opportunities that you're really given carte blanche to rebrand yourself as someone completely different. And yet in that moment of making that pivot, they have to let go of this previous identity in order to make space for this new direction. And they find it very hard because there's so much pride and accomplishment, rightfully so, in this former world. But they really struggle with adopting the language, the motivation, the headspace of this new thing they say they want, because it requires clearing out this former version of themselves. And in those moments, you almost wonder, are you afraid you can't do it again? You got to the top of a little mountain, right? That's how you were successful enough to get into Harvard. And to do this, you have to go back down the mountain to climb a new mountain. And are you, at the back of your mind, are you kind of I don't know if I can get back to the top of the mountain? Maybe I got lucky. Maybe I had an advantage here that I'm not going to have in that new world, right? There's this moment where I realize, and I imagine this has got to be true for both of you as immigrants. I am a child of a working class family with no Harvard in our blood. I know I started from zero. And so coming back down from one mountain to climb a new one, it's not as scary because I know I had to go up from the bottom. And I wonder if people who start from a place of privilege secretly fear that they can't get up a new mountain on their own. They know that they started halfway up. And so part of this, again, becomes the reframing of your story of, were you successful because of these external factors, your family's connections, the luck of where you went to school, all of those things? And you could acknowledge that privilege is true and still call out, okay, but what were your contributions to your success? You showed up. You did the work. You went over and above. You contributed to the relationships before you needed to ask for something in return, right? Being able to parse out, here's what I brought, whether or not I also had these other things going for me. means I bring those things to whatever new mountain I want to climb, right? That just requires a level of quite honestly, like therapy, self-awareness that a lot of students haven't done before.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Privilege is an interesting thing, especially in the immigrant community, because like I'm a second generation immigrant in Canada. My grandparents were in India, and my mom was born in London, moved to Canada. My dad was born in Canada. I was second generation Canada, and then I moved to the States. Kevin moved straight to the States, and we are, I think, as immigrants, I think we both come from very privileged positions, and we come from that position where we are taught less that we came from nothing, more that we came from our parents' sacrifices. I don't want to speak for Kevin, but is that a similar?
You definitely like live with the knowledge of your time here is paid for. A lot of resources are dedicated specifically towards, just your, I guess, very existence or presence.
I think that you feel like every choice you make has a cost, and that story has been told to you over and over again as you calculate those choices, so that you never waste a choice, waste an opportunity, and that's completely understandable, and also probably feels like a really big weight sometimes. No?
Yeah, and I think for me, part of the layoff experience was actually there was a sense of relief, which is interesting with what you were talking about earlier, Christina, of people being on the peak of a mountain and being afraid of kind of falling off that. Is there's definitely the fear of that when I was still having the job. It started feeling like you're treading on thinner and thinner ice because you stay in that position in a relatively successful and privileged spot. But there's always the fear of what would be the opportunity cost, let's say, of changing.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is why one of the greatest skills or muscles that you can build, in my opinion, in your 20s and early 30s, is the muscle of starting over, right? If you stay somewhere for so long, you're good at that one thing. You have that one network. You have this one story about who you are. And the beginning stages atrophy, right? The skill set of how do you get started isn't put to use. And I think this is why, we see so much job hopping in your 20s, and it's in large part because of the market for sure. But I think it's also a really useful skill to learn how to get started. And then as you get to your mid 30s and 40s, then you have to learn how to sustain, right? This is where you like pick a place and now start to really put down roots in a career or a company or a community. But I think at the beginning, the skill is learning how to get started, because that ensures that you are never afraid to walk away from something that isn't right for you and try again. I talk a lot about failure and a lot about taking risks. I think a big part of the power of a portfolio life is that you can add some risk without it being like all or nothing, right? You can say, I'm going to try this hobby. I don't know if I'm going to be any good at stand-up, but like, what's it going to cost if I'm bad, right? A little bit of embarrassment. And you can add a little bit of risk, and you can literally build the muscle of going into a situation where you say, I don't know if I'm going to be any good at this. There's a chance I could fail. And then actually failing sometimes and having to get back up. That is a muscle that will serve you so well in your life. But high achieving people who are afraid of that label of failure, the longer you don't build that muscle, the scarier that sort of looms over you. And I think the more you're going to play it safe in every other choice for the rest of your life. And I think this is crucial because in my view, no one asked me, but I'm on your podcast, so let's pretend you did. The only real failure in life comes from finding out that something is not for you. A relationship, a job, a city, whatever that is. You think it might be for you. You go and you try it. You get new information and you learn this is not for me. and then you don't do anything about it. You stay. You suck it up. You say, well, whatever. I'm scared of starting over, so I'm just going to stay. That, to me, that's the failure. But thinking something might be for you and then trying it and learning it's not a failure. That's just a learning opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this a lot in my therapeutic journey with my therapist, but it's the idea of building resilience, right?
Yes.
Because Kevin and I are both very, very high achieving people, right? That's been our MO for a long time. And I think through our careers, especially me to an extent, because Kevin handles things in healthier ways for some reason. But
We don't know
we
that.
all assume everyone else is handling everything else healthier, right?
Of course.
But like, yeah, these stories of like our careers and our lives, and we spend so much time developing, focusing on it, that going back to the before your life, when I'm reading your work and hearing you talk on these shows, it's like, oh, this is interesting, this balance idea where it's like, I spend so much time focused on one thing. And I do take the excuse that I think immigrants and student visas and things like that are trained to focus you on one thing. But it's interesting, this idea of trying to focus on other things, balancing, understanding your time, understanding your kind of entire portfolio, not just the one thing, and how important it is, especially for high achieving people, to recognize that.
Oh yeah. I mean, and I don't discount that things like visas, things like student loans, and needing the stability of one kind of income rather than freelancing or gigging it around. There are lots of people who have these needs. And it makes sense as you construct your portfolio to say, how am I going to meet those needs? I got to get a job that's going to sponsor my visa. Like, of course. And that might mean for chapters of your life, it might mean you have less space in your portfolio than you might prefer. You might say, because I need this job, it comes with a visa, it has these expectations about the amount of time I'm putting into work. I can't have 16 side hustles. I'm going to have, one hobby, one volunteering thing, and I'm going to make sure I take care of my health, whatever that is. But even having that clarity to say, I'm not only going to put my time, my relationships, my network. I can't emphasize how important diversification of network is. That it's not just diversification of skill sets, although that is helpful, and diversification of how you see yourself, also very helpful. It's diversification of who you can call up for help, for introductions, for feedback that can be really valuable. So just having that framework from the beginning to say, I don't have a ton of space maybe in a given season of life, but the space I do have, I'm going to be really intentional about joining that community or signing up for this class, because I know that that's going to bring me something too. It's going to meet my needs in other ways. And honestly, on the days, I literally had one of these days last week, 2 weeks ago, where I just had a really crap day at work, just like a crap day. We've had those.
Yep.
And then I came home and I got an email about my book that was really, really exciting. Like really exciting. And then the very next morning, while I was still like stomach rumbling about having to go to work after this crap day, found out I was nominated for 3 Tony Awards for my producing work. And I was like, you know what? Screw the crap day. My book is going gangbusters. I'm a Tony nominee. Whatever. Bring on crap day number 2. I can face it, And so just having that to buttress you, at least for me, is really valuable, rather than being like, oh, woe is me, I had a crap day and that's all I am,
Yeah, it's definitely an awesome example and great segue, speaking of diversification, to our next question for you is,
Yeah.
what does it mean for you to be a Broadway producer? Can you speak to that part of your experience?
Of course. I mean,
welcome back to Top Hat. This is usually the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the interesting lessons we got from this week's expert storyteller. But because this is a 2-part episode, we will be doing Top Hat this week at the end of the end of the next episode, so we'll recap the lessons from both parts. So make sure to listen to the next episode for part 2 of this amazing conversation. And this week we started our conversation with Christina Wallace, a Harvard Business School professor, about living a portfolio life, living a balanced life. And it's kind of like we were talking about in the intro of how post-college we really had to learn how to be more intentional about our lives, where we can't just kind of default to all these people being around us doing these unique, cool things and trying all these new cool things easily. We have to be intentional about how we spend our time when we're at work, when we are social, when we are active. We don't have 7 hours of every day to be like, oh, if I work out, I have time to work out. I have 2 hours here. We have to be like, okay, I have this amount of time, have to do this, have to do this. And I think this is really key with the portfolio life, where you have to be intentional. You have to plan your time. You have to sit down and think about what matters to you and make sure you're investing your time, energy, and money into doing those things. Or in a few years or something, you're going to wake up and say, how did I not get to all those things? Because that's life. If we don't prioritize things, we're going to default to what's easy or what's comfortable versus making intentional efforts. And that's story time. We are to write the story we want to live, right?
And we have more cool discussions on the way for part 2 with Christina. For our next episode, we will get into the interesting similarities and knowledge gaps between investing in tech and investing in Broadway shows.
That sounds awesome.
Some insights into storytelling for investing, Broadway storytelling. Get excited for part 2 of our conversation with Christina Wallace. In the meantime, if you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Leave us a comment and review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPTpod. LinkedIn, Linen Student Plastic Tie.
One of the most exciting parts about the current life and places we live in time is that we can get access to world-class education for free, easily. In today's episode, you got to hear from a Harvard Business School professor who teaches in some of the most rarefied air in one of the most elite institutions for free. You're doing great. We appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time. And we will see you next time on the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast.